So we're trying to find a nexus between the three: supply, demand, something to do with the underlying interest rate or the creditor shock, and perhaps an ESG requirement where the borrower or the owner doesn't have the money to bail out his problem. Any local partner of ours feels that if it, is the extra 5% or 10% some other group might pay him worth it? No, because they know that actually when we say we're going to do something, we'll deliver, and that's much more powerful than an extra 5 points. How do you acquire an asset, fix it, and make it ready for that investor base and sell it to the investor base? And the rationale was, if you can make a 20 to 30% unlevered profit on cost, and you can do it within 3 to 5 years, you then with a bit of leverage, you could generate very good returns that investors would be happy with.
Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast. Today, we are joined by Keith Breslauer, Managing Director and Senior Partner at Patron Capital. Established in 1999, Patron Capital Partners has evolved into one of the leading opportunistic real estate managers in Europe. To date, it has raised over 5.4 billion euros and has undertaken more than 200 transactions across 106 investments in 17 countries. The Patron organisation includes a 64-person in-house team with offices in the UK, Spain and Luxembourg. Patron's strategy is to back local partners and management teams in growing their respective businesses, investing in property, corporate operating entities, credit-related businesses, and debt-related instruments, whose value is primarily supported by property assets. Keith started his career at Lehman Brothers in New York and is a graduate of NYU and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And it gives me great pleasure that he's here today. So Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Not at all. Well, look, the listeners love hearing about entrepreneurs and founders' stories, and I'm really interested to get on to how and why you set up Patron and a little bit about the business later in our conversation. But before we get there, can you give me a little bit of context to where you're from, your upbringing, and kind of maybe how those early years have defined who you are today?
Sure. So I grew up originally effectively New York, but in a city in Jersey City, which is right next to Manhattan. Went to high school in New York, went to university in New York. Very good parents, good people. Unfortunately, my father's a real estate developer that was always perpetually undercapitalized. So from a very young age, I lived through the boom and bust cycles that happened in property. And around 16 years old or so forth, around that time, I decided to really set up my own first business that helped support me in my things I wanted to do in high school. And then university, I had a very good business that got me to graduate school. And then from graduate school, I got a good job in industry. So I would say the early years were formative in the sense that I had very good parents who were very supportive emotionally, but financially we were a bit strapped. And I woke up one day realizing that it's something that I needed to figure out how to solve for.
And so you realized that business or taking an entrepreneurial route would give you that opportunity to make your own money or carve your own way?
I never really thought of the concept of an entrepreneurial aspect. In fact, I didn't really learn that word until grad school. What I knew was that there was a opportunity. I needed to make money. I knew that there were a lot of people out there who weren't prepared to work as hard as I was prepared to work. And if I found the right opportunity, I could make sufficient money to pay for my parents and my family and the lifestyle that I wanted to have. So the real aspect was, what was it going to take to do that? And back in the years of when I was in university, there was very organized structures and organized interviewing processes, et cetera. And I realized that I was not in that mold, and I had to figure out a way to beat the mold. And that's one of the reasons why I set up my first business in college, and that took care of quite a bit and helped me get into graduate school, which I felt was the golden key to potentially land a job at that time. So it was less what I want to be an entrepreneur or not. It was much more about what was my primary objective and how was I going to get there? And that was really the goal, and that's what led to the start of a lot of these sort of business ideas and thoughts.
And what businesses were they that you kind of dabbled in those early years?
So I was in America, when you go to university, is quite expensive in the United States. So even back then, so the way they deal with it is that they say, okay, well, we'll lend you some money. We'll give you work study, and then maybe get a bit of extra money if you can from your family. So I didn't really have much of that. So I went to work study in the computer department because I was a math, I liked math and I understood computers a bit. And it's right around the time that the IBM PC was first invented, and you had the XT, and this is before Windows, to give a perspective. When I was working in the computer department, I realized that there was a lot of small businesses that have bought computers and simply did not know how to have customized software for their work. So for example, if you want to run a payroll system at the time, you either had to use a mainframe system, or you were a small business, imagine 5-6 professionals, and you were trying to jerry-rig at the time Lotus or some other software to run your payroll system. I was working in a computer lab in university. There was a lot of graduate students there. So I went to them and I said, hey, could you write me software that would be an overlay on top of Lotus, or then called WordStar, or a variety of other programs that could help these small businesses? And they could. So I figured out, well, why don't I join the two up? I could hire these individuals as consultants. We could write customized software for these companies. We could charge them a fee, and that would be good enough for them to run their businesses. And we had quite a few companies that did that, including, as one example, Dime Savings Bank, from memory, did a tender on concept of queuing theory. So back then, it was the early stages of saying, how long would it take for you to wait online at a bank teller? And they would have a sign. Right? That back then, they were just creating all that. We wrote the software to drive that determination. Or you had a testing service, imagine, for exams, and they would do thousands of tests. Well, the way they would record those exams, when you fill it in a multiple choice, is through a scanning system. We wrote that software. So that was a very good idea at the time, and it was very interesting, and it helped pay for quite a few bits, and that's kind of what. So we took advantage, going back to the question, we took advantage of the market and opportunity where you had demand, in that you had users who needed to use their computers better, already spent quite a bit of money on their equipment but didn't know how to use it. You didn't have anyone competing in the space really at the time providing that service, so we were bridging that gap, and that's how we were doing well.
Where did real estate factor in? You touched on your dad was a real estate developer, boom, bust or so. Did you always lean into that as a career, or did you put it off because your dad was involved, and then post-university you thought actually it could be an interesting route to pursue?
My grandfather was originally an electrician, became an electrical contractor. My grandmother was a very smart lady, and between the two of them, he set up a very, very big business, and he was the founder of the first electrical contractors union in New York, and he did all the New York public school systems. So my father grew up in a relatively middle-class background, and he pursued the art of development and becoming a developer, but he never really had that education or that experience to understand scalable concepts, and therefore he was always struggling with capital. So as a kid, I hated real estate. I grew up around it. I walked sites since I was 6-7 years old. I've been on every type of construction site you could imagine, and I just was like, this is really not what I want to do. And perhaps the reason at the time was I saw that it wasn't a very successful career for my own dad, and I had to figure out a way to get out of it. So the way to make money is to go into scalable businesses. And if you think about scalable businesses, it's the money business or it's technology. And at the time, technology was big, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I chased and hunted working in a finance space. I happened to get hired into financial services, which was essentially investment banking for banks and savings and loans, or building societies. And that led me to being very involved in secured credit. So I was, which is backed by property largely. So indirectly, we ended up in property, but I didn't start out that way. I started out in financial services, and the idea was to scale through that. Ended up in property because we were doing credit-related businesses. Then we were doing distressed credit. Then we were taking over the property. And they were like, well, let's just buy the real estate. So that evolution took about probably 5 to 10 years of my career of going from sort of that banking story to more of a pure property story.
And that was at Lehman's, right?
Mostly at Lehman, yeah. So at Lehman Brothers, phenomenal firm. And I joined in the US, and I worked in that group. And then about 5 years into my career, when Robert Maxwell passed away or died, Lehman Brothers asked me to come to London to work on getting our money back from the Maxwell estate. And I came, and I saw a big opportunity in 1992 of a largely distressed residential market in England. And I thought there was a potential angle for Lehman Brothers to be investing in property in Europe. So we, as a group and as a firm, decided to do this. My job was effectively to deploy the capital and to make money in the space, which we did, and it turned out to be very lucrative. So that evolution happened largely at Lehman Brothers.
And that was, you said, residential property.
Well, it was actually everything in the end, but we started out as doing residential credit, which was the opportunity. Remember, interest rates were around 12, 13%, so everything was bust. So we did residential in UK, we did commercial in France, we then did second homes and sort of leisure in south of France. We looked a lot in Germany, but that was essentially over sort of 92 to 97 period. And
in terms of the kind of the tickets that you'd normally write at that size, were they quite small, granular, and it was just about amassing scale?
It was generally small, but it wasn't granular in that you were really underwriting, turning around underlying property. It was much more about how cheap you could buy it and then finding the next guy to unload it to. So that was really the difference between what I used to do and kind of what we've been doing the past 25 years, that the original years were more of a statistical bet. You were buying portfolios or you were buying loans in which you were assuming that one way or another you're going to sell it to someone else at a 20 to 30% profit spread pre-leverage. So if you did that, you'd make quite good money, but that was the idea.
And when you touched on obviously kind of entering, you got into real estate by default really through kind of the banking route. When did you think, actually, this is a career that I want to stick in, this is the part of real estate, or this is, I really enjoy this, and kind of having that different perspective other than your father's perspective, kind of the life went on?
I think after 10 years of Lehman Brothers, I made enough money to get my parents out of their shitty house and get my wife and I a nice apartment and have a reasonably better life than the life I grew up with. So I already was buying into the industry. That was easy. The hard bit was to figure out how to scale it further. And the way to scale it further was through the fund business. So raising a fund which uses capital to invest in property becomes the opportunity, as opposed to finding opportunities and running around trying to find capital. I didn't want it. That was the path that my father did, and I thought that was a difficult path to follow, particularly when the markets go south. So to me, it was much more interesting if we could figure out a way to scale what we were doing through the fund business. And essentially, if you look at where we are today, and really the past 25 years, we have the property investment business, which is kind of the engine that makes it all work. But the fuel is essentially the fund business where we raise capital that feeds into the engine and generates the profits. So, I would say early on, I bought in. I already moved away from the world of my father for 1 or 2 years out of the box. However, the ultimate reality of property investing is it is granular, and you have to remember that. And that's what we spent a lot of time doing, particularly as Patron over the past 25 years.
So can you just talk to me about leaving Lehman and what the plan was, what the strategy was in terms of going about raising a fund and establishing a business?
Sure. So, one of the issues or challenges is that when you work within a large investment bank, no matter how good you are, how good you think you are, you need to prove it to the outside world. And you have the benefit of this enormous engine, this enormous machine that is basically supporting you, whether it's simple things or things like treasury or finance or tax, accounting or legal or currency or anything else. You are relying on the firm to help you do that. So the challenge, of course, is how do you convince someone that you can exist and survive outside of the mothership of Lehman Brothers? And I think that was always a question. And at the time, there was quite a few funds that was talking to me because Lehman Brothers wanted me. I got promoted. I was asked to move back to New York. I was now very seriously considering not going back to New York and staying in Europe. So my choice was joining another firm like Lehman Brothers, theoretically, joining a fund and working for the fund, or doing it on my own. And I was really struggling with that and question, obviously the solution. And an opportunity came along with Lone Star, which is run by a phenomenally smart investor, John Graken. And he basically came to me and said, I was being compared to some other people, and said, listen, I'm not really sure you should be part of Lone Star or not, but why don't we agree a joint venture and we'll do a 1-year venture and we'll see how it goes. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't, we'll go our separate ways. So it lasted about a year and a half. And what it did for me personally was it gave me the confidence I could leave the mothership of Lehman Brothers and survive. That was a big one, very important issue. And the second thing is it gave me a bit of a track record outside of Lehman Brothers. And three is it probably gave me a bit of money because some of the deals we did very well. So on the back of all that, at the end of the year and a half, we parted ways, and I went to set up Patron, and that was in 1999, late 98, early 99.
And so was it just you at, day one at Patron, just you, or did you kind of have a team, or did you lean on people that you previously worked with and said, look, come and join the party?
Yeah. So the question was, you always have to think about the end goal, and then you work backwards. So the end goal was raising a fund or a capital pool that we would have the ability to make decisions on. How do you get to the end goal? Well, you have to prove your track record. You have to have a team that's somewhat credible. It has to be a bit better than a piece of paper or something written on a napkin. So how do you do that? Well, you have to probably bring some good people on board. You probably need to invest some money. You probably need to do a few deals. And then you could make a more of a credible argument to raise a fund. And that's essentially what we did. So I knew a very good lawyer who worked at another competitor firm another firm. And she joined. I knew a really good real estate person at the time that I thought was a good underwriting type person. So he joined. I got a good assistant, and really, essentially, the four of us started this concept of going after to raise a fund. And I put together a set of documents, and we started the early stages of marketing. In the meantime, we went hunting, and we started working on transactions. And I had the benefit of a very good man named Poyu Zabladovich, bit of a complicated name, but a fantastic guy. And he backed me originally on some of the earlier transactions. And I said, hey, why don't we go work on it together? I'll put up all my money and whatever I had, and you help me. And we did a very interesting transaction where we ended up managing Royal Bank of Scotland had a private equity department, and they gave us about 77 million pounds of equity in a transaction that we did, which turned out to be a home run. We made a lot of money. The Royal Bank made a lot of money. We made a lot of money. But importantly, it established a great deal of credibility for us. And we did a few other deals like that.
What deal was that?
It was called iGroup. iGroup was we called it iGroup. It was originally called Aquin, or the reverse of Nuco. Aquin was a conduit mortgage lender in the U.S. and built a big British business. And what it did effectively is it lent money largely to self-employed individuals and did it in bulk and then securitized it. And it wasn't really quite subprime. It was a little bit different. And the business was tremendous. And we had a great management team, and it grew fantastically. We sold that business to GE, and we did it in 18 months, and we made a lot of money. So going back to the fundraising and the whole start of it all, so now we had a big deal that we did. We had a few other deals that were in process. We had this good team that was working. And then we got a bit lucky. And the lucky bit was that we spent a lot of time talking to multiple investors. And one particular investor, which was MIT, said, hey, we really like what you're doing. And if you fly to Boston, we'll figure it out. So I got on a plane that night, flew to Boston. And a gentleman named Peter Lewis, who has passed since, who's a phenomenal person, basically backed us. And they were really the early stage people. But we had people like the Church Pension Fund, University of Michigan, University of North Carolina, Tom Singh, a group called Sagato, which is Wafiq Sayed. So between a collection of about, 6 or 7 investors, which are fantastic names, we were able to secure about 110 million euros of equity. It was about half of what we originally set out to do, but it was enough to get started and to prove the story. And that's how it went. So it took 2 years from the beginning of the formation of the business, which is 99, call it. We started fundraising 2000, give or take, late 2000, early 01. I think we had our close in 01, 02. So that gives you a sense of the brutality of the business. And you had to believe, because at the time, the real estate person who I brought on board actually left halfway through and went back to Lone Star. That's obviously a big hit when you have 4 people and one guy leaves and he's your property guy. So we had to deal with that. We had all kinds of bumps along the way. And I would say at any given day, people in the organization weren't really sure it was going to work. But I believed it would work. I believe with a lot of hard work and good focus, we would shine. And that's what happened. But it just took a lot of effort.
And at that moment in time, what was the strategy, the pitch, the kind of the marketing stuff that you were selling to these potential LPs?
It's a very similar strategy today. There is a lot of opportunity that exists on a pan-European basis in which you have a type of property or property-related assets which isn't quite ready for an institutional investor market. That's on one side. On the other side is you have institutional investor capital, again, particularly in Europe, that is very much focused on property, have a allocation for property and want to buy property. And then you have a high net worth family office group, which is much more focused on real estate as opposed to, say, liquid securities. So how do you bridge the two? How do you acquire an asset, fix it, and make it ready for that investor base and sell it to the investor base? And the rationale was, if you can make a 20 to 30% unlevered profit on cost, and you could do it within 3 to 5 years, you then with a bit of leverage, you could generate very good returns that investors would be happy with. So that is exactly what we do today, is what we did go back 25 years ago, or 23 years ago or so with the first fund. The only real difference is that we're much bigger now, so the deals are bigger. But the concept of having a diversified fund that invests across asset classes and say across 4 to 5 active markets, that remains the case.
Who were your competitors at the time, and was it unique to be talking to US capital and bring it over to the UK and across Europe as well, or was that kind of quite a well-trodden path?
No, it wasn't. It definitely wasn't well trodden. I mean, there were a few people getting into the fund business in a very big way in the U.S., including obviously Lone Star and a variety of others. And Goldman was really the biggest with Whitehall. Excuse me. And there were a few other larger groups, but there was very few managers in Europe that was running a diversified pool of capital and getting that money largely from the U.S. The only other group that was similar to us was there are probably a few others, but from memory, which is a great group, was Orion, and it was Vance Seltz and Arif Laham and Bruce Bassam, and they had a similar idea to me, but they were going much larger because they had a very good relationship at the time with Travelers Insurance, from memory, and a variety of other big U.S. groups, and therefore they grew quicker, or they were bigger because they had this huge institutional backing. But they were the only other real similar group, and I would say Arif and I, and along with obviously with Van and Bruce, are really the early stage groups that did this. And within the first fundraising of Fund 1 cycle, other people started joining that world. So I'm going to guess, I would say in the first 5 years, probably it grew from a couple to 15 or so managers across Europe in general. These are dedicated European guys as opposed to global. The global guys were still coming, but they weren't really dedicated European arms.
Did you make a conscious decision to set up local teams on across the continent, or was everything kind of run out of London at this stage and you worked with local operating partners? What was the kind of the model?
Well, what you know in real estate is that it's an incredibly local business, right? So you could walk a property, you think you know everything because you've seen it and whatever, but you discover that the next door neighbor, has a water damage, or the next door street is it's a terrible neighborhood, or there's drug dealers on the corner or something. And there's all kinds of localized stuff that you really need to have a local presence. Now, if you want to run a pan-European business and you don't want to be dedicated to one product, you have to, the coffees are wearing off. You have to look across the piece and say, okay, well, how am I going to scale Europe? Well, the only way you scale Europe is that you find lots of individuals in these local markets that you'll work with. You then back them in some kind of what I would call a hybrid joint venture model, and you together would access, find, identify the opportunities and pursue them. And that's what we do. So essentially, we're not really an allocator and we're not an owner-operator. We're somewhere in the middle. And that's what we call it, the hybrid model. So we have people on the ground. They work very closely with our team. We have a very big team with 60 people in the overall business, so that they work closely with the local groups. And together we execute the plan.
That's one of my questions, is how do you create alignment between LP, your team, and local operating partners? Because how do you create that alignment and purpose, mission, vision to create value?
So one of the interesting sort of observations in life is a financial, or is a spreadsheet good enough? is a financial formula good enough? If I promise you X percent of the action, is that going to be good enough to create alignment? So the textbook says yes, but in reality, it's not always obvious. So the relationship between the LPs is obviously economic because we get paid a lot if we do really well. But there's an enormous fiduciary sense of responsibility. We consider the LPs family, and we have very close relationships with them. Most of our investors have been with us for 15 to 20 years. And that's extremely important in terms of cultivating, creating, honoring, respecting, and not disrespecting that base. So the investor relationship or the alignment is strong because it's aligned through money and it's through relationship. The local operating partner is similar. You have a formula. They do very well if we do well. But what do they want? They want a couple of first of all, what do investors want? They want obviously great performance, but they want absolute transparency. They want absolute clarity in what's happening at any moment in time. So if you were, like the biblical statement, do unto others as you do to yourself. If you were an investor in yourself, what would you want, right? You would want to know what's happening all the time and not to be assumed you're some mug that you got taken advantage of. So we treat our investors as active partners, although practically they really are passive limited partners. They know everything as we know it, and that's a very simple golden rule. Now you think about local partners or local operating guys. What do they want? Well, they want capital. They want to know they can make decisions quickly. They want confidence that if you make a decision, you're not going to change your mind. And they want, therefore, transparency on your underwriting process. So we provide them with that. We're not a global fund. We are a European-focused fund. We have enormous experience in Europe. And they get to meet all the decision makers. So any local partner of ours feels that is the extra 5% or 10% some other group might pay them worth it? No, because they know that actually when we say we're going to do something, we'll deliver. And that's much more powerful than an extra 5 points.
Certainty.
So certainty is absolutely key. Absolutely key. And I think when you're in this business and you're raising money or you're investing money, on the spreadsheet says you're going to be a very wealthy man, but in reality, you might make zero because the guy never says yes to anything you're working on. So we're very much into making sure that people we work with understand us and we deliver consistent messaging. And the flip side is they're highly confident that if we say we're going to do something, we will deliver on it. So that's the two, going back to alignment, that's how we align from the local guy back to the investor.
Amazing. Talk to me about Fund One. Raised 110 million euros or so. Can you just talk to me about a couple of the transactions you did, where you did them, and the results that came off the back of them?
Sure. So I was actually technically $110 million at the time. So the first fund was a US dollar fund. The rest of the fund were euro denominated funds. Fund One consisted of buying individual assets in residential buildings and office buildings, et cetera. The two interesting deals that I would perhaps highlight, one was the Hotel Arts and the other was Simon Storage. So the Hotel Arts was a as people might know, it's a Ritz-Carlton in Barcelona. It was part of his complex called Port Olympic. It was owned by Sogo, the Japanese retailer. They were struggling financially. They were trying to sell their non-Japanese assets. What was for sale at the time was a hotel, obviously the ground underneath it, which included a conference center and a parking facility, the casino, which was adjacent, a office building next door and a piece of land. We teamed up with Deutsche Bank and a very large Spanish high net worth group. We essentially backed a very smart individual on the transaction, and we worked very closely with those people. And we broke up effectively that portfolio and sold off the individual bits, cleaned up a bit of the management-related issues, and then sold off the property as well. So that was more of a distressed opportunity play where the seller was in trouble and had to fix the capital structure. And then we were able to execute on a breakup play on an asset-by-asset basis. I'm simplifying it, but that's effectively what it is. What was the big risk? The big risk was we were buying a tower, because the Hotel Arts is a large tower, and it sits next to another tower, which was map-free. And it's on the flight line going into Barcelona Airport. And we bought it right after 9/11. And I think at the time, had 30 to 40% American guests. So the underwrite question was, do you really believe the Americans are going to come back or not? Because back then, everyone thought that was it, the world was over. So we didn't believe that, and we took the risk, and that's where we are. The second example was called Simon Storage. Simon Storage came to us because at the time, Guy Hands was trying to buy a port. And we really looked at that and said, that's pretty interesting, but the port is complicated. There's a lot of operational issues and everything else. But what's on the port in many of these industrial ports in England are tank farms. These are very large cylindrical tanks which store gas or oil, actually not gas, oil or other products. And if you really dig deep, they're big warehouses that have 13 to 15 year weighted average length contracts. So we said, hey, if we could buy that cheap enough, we could make a lot of money. So we effectively, and at the time, the company was, the biggest port was 50% owned by another group. And so we went to that group who then also was struggling with cash and bought that stake. And then we acquired Simon Storage, which was a division of Simon Group PLC. And they were under attack for underperforming public shares and stock. So the aspect was back management, extract the business, grow it, and sell it. And that's essentially what we did. We extracted the business, we stabilized performance, we grew it, and then we sold the entire business to a Canadian MLP, which is a master limited partnership, which was basically focused on oil and gas.
Quick one from me. If you haven't already subscribed or followed this show on the podcast or app where you listen or watch, please do. It takes 10 seconds and helps tremendously. I've got really big plans for the People Property Place podcast, and that one small action really helps grow the show and the presence and enables us to keep doing what we're doing. So if you haven't already, please follow or like on the platform you watch or listen to. Thanks so much. And so the kind of the vintages you raised, 3 to 5 year private equity type return profiles, and you managed, as you touched on earlier, you've had a phenomenal kind of re-up from existing LPs. It can't have all been plain sailing. There must have been some significant challenges or learnings. What if you can kind of, maybe cast your eye back to the global financial crisis, what are some of the learnings or challenges you've had to overcome as you've raised new funds and new vintages?
Right. So on an average basis, we have made a 15% gross return over 25 years investing in Western Europe. That's a headline number. That sounds amazing. In reality, it's brutal. So what actually has if you go through the journey, we did Fund 1. It was extremely successful. We made enormous returns. We then went to raise Fund 2, and instead of 2 years, it took us, let's say, 6 months. And instead of raising half of what we wanted, we got $300 million against a $250 million ask. We invested half of that, the first half. We made a lot of money. We did incredibly well. We were also making a lot of money in Central Europe. And we started to run out of money quickly. So I went to raise Fund 3, and this time we raised about $900 million, which was 3 times the amount of money we wanted in about 6 weeks. And I took the money. So that was the first mistake. So we tripled the size of the business essentially in a year. And that was a big mistake because it wasn't quite clear to me in hindsight that we were really ready for it. But
in terms of infrastructure, personnel?
Infrastructure perhaps, but more underwriting perspective. So we were going from buying distressed real estate, distressed loans, individual properties, small portfolios, some spin out of companies, all of a sudden having €1 billion of cash. So where was the best way to deploy it at the time? So at the time, Central and Eastern Europe were doing very well. We were making a lot of money there. And there's a real opportunity to buy old warehouses, knock them down, and build multifamily or mixed-use assets and make a fortune. So on the paper, the models said you'll make a 35 to 40% return on basically creating housing for people who never had housing before that level. And we did that. We went into Poland in a big way. We went into Romania. We went into Eastern Europe. And we did that for the second part of Fund 2 and the early stage of Fund 3. In 2007, the world started to get wobbly when Bear Stearns mortgage bonds got re-rated by the agencies. We started to realize that liquidity was getting sucked out of the system. So we slowed down, but we're still pacing. Anyway, when the world ended in kind of late 2008, we woke up one day and we said, okay, the back end of Fund 2 was underperforming. It was very low leverage, but everything got extended. the first part of Fund 3 was underperforming. Again, it looked okay, but instead of a 3-year plan, it was extending out quite dramatically. So we said, okay, hold on. And then we used the second half of Fund 3's money to invest smartly in buying stuff that was distressed. So when we finished that process, we were one of the few funds that didn't blow up. We didn't lose a lot of money yet or at that stage. So we went to go raise Fund 4. This is now post '08. There was a big opportunity to take advantage of it, and we raised €1 billion of equity. So going through the sequencing of the event, Fund 2 and 3 ended up losing basically expenses, but got investors of capital back, less expenses, which is better than our peer set. And Fund 4 turned out to make a 24% return, which did very, very well. Fund 5 was a fantastic vintage. Originally was doing really well. Then we got hit by COVID. So everything we were working on got delayed. So in the end, I think we'll do okay because we brought 92% of the money back quickly, but it's challenging. And then Fund 6, we were deploying and it's doing very well. Again, interest rates, another shock to the system. Rates go up dramatically and it hurt. But in all these cases, our leverage was only maximum, called 50-55% on average across the books. So we never suffered like others did, which is like, wow, I got to give the keys back. And that's one of the reasons why we survived and we grew.
And is that because of your time at Lehman? You'd seen a lot of transactions. You'd seen a lot at that time. You wanted to have a cap in terms of your LTV because other people were borrowing at 90, 95, 100.
Yeah,
plus,
I think it was growing up in the distressed business, like you said, at Lehman Brothers. I was also knowing what my father did. In fact, my father's very first distressed deal was a ski resort development in upstate New York. The sign from that development hangs next to me on my desk to remind me of how it goes wrong and what goes wrong. So I would say yes. I would say that gave me a lot of perspective on leverage and being very, very careful. And if you go back to the original thesis, the thesis was we were raising large pools of capital to invest in equity. And therefore, there was an opportunity to deploy equity as opposed to levered equity, which in itself increased the risk. So we were a bit nervous about leverage anyway.
Have you ever struggled in terms of focus because you're so geographically diverse and type of transaction, you can kind of access the market is so broad. You have to see a lot of deals. It's not necessarily as focused on a single sector or geography or particular strategy. How do you reconcile that?
Very good partners. So we have 6 or 7 partners internally within Patron who are very good. They are responsible for their regions, and they worry about their regions, all the time. We don't really lose focus per se in that A, the partner's doing it with his team, but B, we have systems in place and reportings in place that basically extracts out the key issues of each opportunity, whether we're looking at it or whether we own it, and then make sure that we're monitoring it and managing it on a regular basis. So that report, or we call it the Key Next Steps report, is what keeps me focused on making sure I understand what's happening. For example, and then what you then do is you complement it by being on the road and looking at property. So yesterday I was in one of our locations and I walked 5 or 6 opportunities that we already own in one location and 2 or 3 in the other. And that gave me a lot more guidance and perspective on what we're worrying about and helped me refocus.
You've recently raised 860 million euros for Fund 7. Can you just talk to me about the opportunity set? You touched on the business in terms of the strategy hasn't really changed in the last 20 years or so. But the types or the size of tickets you write will increase, right? Is 30 to 80 million, is that the sweet spot with an ability or a sidecar to be able to access bigger deals?
So if I focus on the capital question first, let's call it the easier one. I would say 80% of our activity tends to be smaller transactions. So sub 80 million, even sub 30 million. But where we believe there's a thematic story and we can do a repeat business and do quite a lot of equity in the space. So imagine student housing. If we like student housing in England, we might spend 5 or 10 million per site of equity, but cumulatively it might be 100 million years of equity. So we're happy to deploy north of 90 million, call it 100, 110 million or even more in a thematic idea, but each individual transaction is smaller. I would say that's 80 to 90% of our business. 10 to 20% of our business might be larger deals where it's large enough that we like it, and we could do it, but it's too large for our fund. So we might get additional co-investment from other parties in helping us do that. So today we are exclusive on 3 transactions where individually we could probably do them, but collectively we can't, and they're very similar. So that's one of the challenges. Now, where is the opportunity set today? I would argue that there's two ways of looking at the world. There's the thematic stuff where you have a supply-demand imbalance, and there's always an opportunity there. Imagine residential, imagine student housing, imagine semi-light industrial. And then you have the distressed stuff, or more challenging opportunities, where you have an interest rate problem or a loan problem. You have an ESG issue where the building is non-compliant. And it might be in a good way in a market which has too much or a lot of demand, not enough supply. So we're trying to find a nexus between the three: supply, demand, something to do with the underlying interest rate or the creditor shock, and perhaps an ESG requirement where the borrower or the owner doesn't have the money to bail out his problem.
And is it a case of just being patient right now? Because the sense I get from the people that I talk to in the market is there's quite a lot of extend, pretend, wait, elections on a doorstep, there's the thought that interest rates are coming down. Is it a case of you just being patient, waiting for these distressed opportunities to rear their heads?
The old story, when you're looking at the curve and you're trying to buy at the bottom of a curve and then ride it up, you probably miss it, right? So you end up buying near the bottom of the trough. You go through the trough, you're still buying, and then at some point, you're able to take advantage and move up that and even get out. So I think on the distress side, we're actively looking. Is there a lot of distress today like '08? No. The leverage doesn't exist. The leverage that does exist is pretty low. And therefore, the banks might say, you busted the interest rate covenant or your DCR, but you've gone from a 55% loan to value to 75. As long as you keep paying my loan, I'll let you live. And that's what you're seeing a lot of. So going back to your expression of extend and pretend, it used to be survive to 25. Now they say don't deep six to 26. I think that was in Pensions and Endowments or something. But it's a very good way of understanding. So you don't have this pressure that you used to have where, an Irish bad bank got created or a Spanish bad bank got created. But there is problems. So we are picking off or trying to pick off those individual opportunities. To answer your question, no, we are not waiting. We think the opportunity exists today. It might be that we don't close for another 6 months, but we do think you have to do the work now to figure it out.
Now that you've closed Fund 7, does that mean you're no longer looking for capital?
Well, I think there's two concepts. One is you're always trying to build relationships over the long term. And since we're in this business for a long-term perspective, we most likely will be, the new fund will come out in a couple of years, and therefore, potential investors might be interested in that. But in advance of that, what we have a lot of is that from time to time, we'll have a big transaction, and we will go to our existing investors and say, are you interested in co-investing in this? Because we have a rule that we don't want to put more than 5 to 10% of our fund in any given investment. And if you follow that logic and you do a deal that's more than 80 million or 90 million of equity, you need a co-investor. So we'll go to our investors and we'll say, are you interested? And if they say no, we will then go to the outside space. So to your question, it's important for us to have relationships because you just never know. Right now, we are working on a couple of transactions where we have complete third-party investors who will invest with us alongside the fund. So we are always looking for money in some form or another. Right now, the form tends to be co-investment capital. In a couple of years, it'll be the fund again. So it really depends.
And that capital, is that coming from corporate pension plans, endowments, foundations, charities, high net worths? And have you seen that capital base or LP base change in recent times or not?
So we don't get really from charities per se. We get from charitable foundations, which are effectively charities. But the answer to your question is the composition of the investor base hasn't really changed that much for us in many years. The geographical source of the capital has dramatically changed. So we used to get most of our money out of the US. We now got almost all of our new money out of non-US markets. And the question then is why? And is that something that others should think about? And the answer to that is that US money, which is the largest pot of capital, frankly, in the world for value-add and opportunistic, largely piled into real estate in a very big way when interest rates were low, or they smell a bigger opportunity at home, which is a domestic bias. So getting US capital that may or may not be available, let's say imagine is available to focus on European real estate is much harder today than it was 5 years ago. And therefore the non-Americans, the Europeans, the Asians, the Canadians are much more attracted to European real estate, and that's what we've been tapping into.
The election is on our doorstep. What's your take on that? And what opportunities or challenges will you as a real estate investor have to navigate or overcome with that on the horizon?
So investing is fundamentals about supply and demand. It's also about flow of capital, right? Which is there capital that's interested in buying the finished product or not? And how does capital think, and how do those flows maneuver? It's very much like waves. They come, they move. Sometimes you have mixed water. Sometimes you have water going in one direction. It's never quite obvious on how that plays out. What you do know, though, is that the more certainty you have in a system, the easier it is to understand how that flow will work, and that flow will conform or will follow through that with that certainty. So going to your political question, the regardless of which political party you supported or don't, the bigger question or the bigger challenge is complete lack of certainty. There is lack of certainty today on what the Labour government, if they were to win, and they came in, let's say, with a very wide majority, what would they do? What policies would they have? You have both the stated policies, which you're hoping that will continue or not continue, in assuming that the Labour Party remains intact. But you also have the policy they haven't talked about. What will really happen with capital gains tax? What will really happen with carried interest? Will that become ordinary income? What will private equity or investors do when all that happens? Will people leave? Will they not leave? How will they invest their capital? So the lack of certainty is a much bigger issue than knowing what's supposed to happen and planning for it. And what happens when you have uncertain times is people default typically to the worst of those times and assume that will happen. In the investing space, and what I grew up doing and I do, is in the worst of times, or when you have greatest uncertainty, you're really trying to find that opportunity where you're able to access something at such a cheap price that even if, let's say, the worst version of that uncertainty happens, you'll be okay. So political instability today is probably the greatest risk to the system that is partially priced in but not fully priced. Geopolitical uncertainty, being war, is really not priced into the market. There is no assumption that Russia will expand and attack Estonia right now, although one could argue it's possible, or that China will attack Taiwan. So I would say, in general, we as investors would like certainty one way or another. Lack of certainty creates a gaping hole, and that's where few will play. We play in that space sometimes, but we're very careful.
You've been phenomenally successful over the years. Has your definition of success changed during that period?
I think as you even say the word, we've been phenomenally successful, I'm highly uncomfortable with that phrase.
Because
I don't really define success necessarily about making money for myself or really the team. I see, have we done the job we set out to do for our investors? If you look at what we told them we were going to do and what has happened, did it work? Yes. I say that somewhat hesitantly. It has not been, I think we've exceeded a lot of investor expectations, but it has not been a home run that I would have wanted it to achieve. Why? Partially because you have incredible uncertain macro dynamics, including COVID, which creates challenges. Have we outperformed what we set out to do and our investors are happy? Yes. But I would not call myself incredibly successful in that I've completely blown it out the door and no matter what happened, have been completely resilient and everything's perfect. So that was one challenge of how I define success. The second is, what have we done? If you really think about it, what is the point of all this? Why are we here? What is the purpose? So our job is to make money for our investors so they could pay typically their pension fund obligations. So imagine the school teacher who has invested, call it $100,000 or euros over the years, and 5% of that money is going into our fund. Our job is to deliver the return relative to the risk that the manager of that capital assumed. So we are working to that strategy. So I would say a clear aspect of understanding why is making sure that we're delivering on that point. And then as people or as a group, are we positively impacting society? That's a very important question to me. And I give you a little bit of an example in a personal perspective. I explained how my father was a good man, but was a developer and had boom and bust all the time. And I remember that I was very close to my father. He's an amazing guy, and he was almost like my brother. But I remember I was always angry at him for years. Most of my life, I was angry at my father. Deep down, I had this resentment that I didn't think he was financially very responsible most of the time. I felt that I was put into situations that I shouldn't have been, and my mother as well. And it really bothered me. And I just felt that wasn't a good thing. And then when he passed, I remember burying him in this wooden box. And I remember reviewing his will, and he didn't really have any money, and I had to assess his situation. And then something like 600 people came to me in different emails or calls or messages and told me about how my father made a difference in their lives and made a positive influence on their lives because he spoke to them or helped them or supported them emotionally or something. And then I woke up and I was like, wow, man, I am the biggest idiot. I completely missed this point. I completely got this wrong. So while I was helping my community in a very important way, I really wasn't helping the wider world. I wasn't really driving my team and my partners to help make a difference in what we could do. And we had the capacity to do it. And I realized that we had this ability. We have a God-given gift, which is this ability to make a difference in the world. And we need to be doing that. And obviously as a priority, fulfilling our professional responsibility. So I would define success, going back to the question, on when we've been able to consistently demonstrate that over many, many years. And therefore, through effectively the multiplier effect, have made a difference in millions of people's lives. Not thousands, millions. Have we done that yet? I think the answer is we're way on that journey, and it's been a fantastic journey. Can we do a lot more? Of course we can. So I think when it's all done and dusted and I'm buried under the ground, if someone could say, okay, this guy or his firm or Patron has made a difference in our lives, in multiple lives, and has achieved its objective for investors and did its professional responsibility, that would be the definition of success.
You do a lot of work with disabled veterans, state school teacher development, but you also kind of back a housing fund for women suffering domestic abuse. Can you just elaborate on a couple of these things? And I know you've also just come back from a channel crossing with the veterans as well.
Sure. So, along the theme of trying to make a difference, I kind of look back and with the team said, okay, what things are important to us? What things do we think we can make a difference? Well, the veterans a long time ago, we met a few people who were quite amazing. And they're part of a group called the Hassler Company, which is essentially then the Royal Marines and actually part of the Navy. And I just said, these are amazing people, and no one realizes what their sacrifices were, what they've done. And unfortunately, in a very classical societal way, they're kind of left behind. So we adopted them, and it was this incredible journey. And this journey has been going on for 14 plus years, 15, actually even longer. And we are today the largest private supporter of the British Royal Marines charity, hands down. We do an enormous amount of stuff with them during the year. We provide a lot of support. We provide training. Our offices are used as the therapy session for Rock to Recovery, which is a phenomenal charity that does PTSD coaching and a variety of other stuff. We work with Climb to Recovery. So we do a lot, and that has had enormous positive impact on people, and has made a very great difference on ourselves. And I'll come back to the D-Day thing. So that's kind of the veteran bit. And plus, we've done a lot of other stuff in the veteran world that we think is important. And then on the education front, we were very involved years ago in a charity called the PTI, which was the Princess Teaching Institute. It's a fantastic organization. I now chair it for many years. And what it does is it provides professional development for state school teachers, mainly through subject-based learning. What was the background behind that? Well, many teachers are burnt out. They've been challenged. They've been dealing with all kinds of issues. We're here to help them, to kind of reignite them and to get them in a positive place. We have about 4,000 to 5,000 teachers a year. We impact, 750,000 kids a year. I've been doing it for 14, 15 years. Again, I've been chair for 3 or 4 years. It's a fantastic organization, makes a difference on the teaching front, and that has more of a multiplier effect. And then the third aspect was, okay, that's great. Well, how are you going to change the world at the local level? You know, I know you're doing it on a nationwide level. And there we said, okay, well, why don't we, Big Society Capital came to us and they said they got this big problem that they realized. How could we help? We spent a lot of time on it. We ended up teaming up with a group called Resonance, and we created this fund called the Women in Safe Homes Fund. And what it does is it provides permanent housing for women and their families who suffer domestic abuse, as well as those who are ex-offenders. And the model is designed not to be a charity, but to be an investable product. So we invest like core real estate. We raise about 30 million quid to do it. I put up, we do it pro bono effectively. I put up about £1 million as an investment, and we as a group put $1.5 million in as expenses. And the goal of which is to make a difference in people's lives. We're trying to impact about 130 families, roughly. I think it's about 21 million so far deployed, so it's going really well. But it's an amazing thing. So, you know, if I put it all together, you know, we have the veterans, we have education, and then we have the Women's Safe Homes Fund. Now, the D-Day point, for what it's worth, is that the veterans, some of the veterans that I've been involved with for many years, particularly Lee Waters and a guy named Joe Maynard, came to me and said, hey, you know, we got this idea that we want to paddle the same crossing that the D-Day boats did, and we're going to go from Portsmouth to Port-au-Bassin. And are you interested? And I said, yeah, of course I'm interested. I said, but I had a major injury a couple of years earlier, had to make sure my back could work, and it did. And I said, okay, I'm in. And what it ultimately led to, and they effectively organized it, and they did it with 4-7 Commando Unit. They participated on the D-Day anniversary in the reenactment of the 4-7 landing on the beach. But prior to that, so on the Monday, we paddled from Portsmouth to Port-au-Bassin in 2-man Klepper kayaks, which are these foldable kayaks, basically from World War II. And it was about 27 hours to 20-hour journey, of which I think we paddled about 18 hours of it because we had a bit of a storm and we had some rotational breaks. And we ended up on the other side. And in my boat was Lee Waters. And Lee Waters was a member of Hassler Company. He served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's a phenomenal human being. He was in a bad place when he came out of service, and he's completely rebuilt himself and his family and his professional life. And he's a fantastic guy. And so I had the opportunity to be with him and Joe Maynard and 17 other people who were really amazing. And collectively, it was an incredible experience. And at the same time, we raised about £40,000. I matched the fundraising, so we raised about 40 grand for the charity. We raised a lot of awareness. That was really the goal, to raise awareness about the charity and the cause, and to bring a little light to people's lives. And I think that was the fantastic thing. Professionally, I think other people in my industry who see what I do, why do I publicize it so much? Is it because I'm an egomaniac? No, I don't really give a shit about that. What I really care about is how do we raise awareness to the charities? How do we raise more money for them? How do I help others, be catalysts to others participating? So that's one of the reasons, if I at 58 years old could paddle 18 hours a boat after breaking my spine in half 2 years ago, then what are you doing sitting at home watching the telly? Right? So that's kind of the logic. You can do more. You can succeed. You just have to set your objectives, set your goals, work very, very hard, and you will achieve. And I think that is a mentality I try to bring to my daily life. And hopefully by participating with the Royal Marines or in various things that they do, or working obviously on the PTI, which is a phenomenal group, or with the Women in Safe Home Fund, people could say, hey, wow, that's amazing. I could do that, or I could achieve and perhaps do better. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in terms of definition of success.
As we draw to a close, Keith, the question I ask everyone on the podcast is, if I gave you £500 million worth of equity, who are the people, what property, and which place would you look to deploy that capital?
I think what you learn over time is that it's very, very difficult to clearly forecast the future. And things go wrong all the time, and it's always hard, but you can generally understand trends. There is a clear lack of supply in residential housing across almost any major Western European market. So I see residential opportunities as the biggest source of opportunity today. There's no question that that is the case, in my mind at least. The question, though, is what is the format of that? Is that rental? Is that built to sell? What actually is that? And how do you consider that, and how do you participate, and which exact market to go in? So what we're trying to do is find the significant supply-demand imbalances and see if we could participate in that. There is a huge supply-demand imbalance in England in residential. We have a massive problem with housing, and that's one reason why it's so expensive in terms of new homes. So can you participate, and how do you participate? So the simple answer is residential would be number one in terms of location-wise. We only invest in Western Europe, so I would say where in Western Europe do we see either residential distress or supply-demand imbalances? So you can imagine in Spain and Portugal and England, you have supply-demand imbalances. To some degree, you have that in Italy. In Germany, you tend to have a bit more distress because a lot of it was using leverage, but there's also supply-demand imbalances. So I would say Western Europe remains interesting. Residential is very, very serious. And in terms of the 500 million pound pot, we would probably diversify that across the different types of residential. So for example, do I really believe in co-living? Okay, it's not obvious. Everyone's jumping in. It's very exciting. There's some good arguments for it. That's okay. Do I believe in single-family rental? Again, there's good arguments and there's also challenges. Do I believe in simply built to sell, normal properties? Again, there's good advantages and disadvantages. So we're looking across the asset class, and I would take the 500 million pounds. I would diversify into different types of residential and in different markets, and focus, clearly on the Western European story. That's what that would. And sounds good, but am I doing it? Yes, I would say 50 to 60% of Fund 7 will be following that path.
You've got 10 advisors or so at Patron. In terms of deploying this capital, is there anyone in terms of your journey that you'd bring on from a people perspective to help you deploy that capital?
Well, it's a bit of a misnomer. The advisors are typically individuals who are external to the team and help us with different issues. So, for example, Sir David Capewell, which is a general in the Royal Marines and retired, helps us with understanding sort of trends and geopolitical issues, as well as it gives us sort of Socratic review of the business. So they're really not crucial necessarily as a group to the deployment of the capital. They help. The crucial people are the internal team. So the call it 7 or 8 partners plus the rest of the team in Patron are absolutely crucial to deploying the money. So I don't believe we need necessarily to bring on more people. What we need to do is make sure that our existing partners feel comfortable, are activated, have energy, and are excited about the future. And whether that's Christoph Ignatiak, who runs our German business, or Pedro Barcelo in our Spanish business, or Irina, who does our student housing and a bit of healthcare, or Daniel Weiss on the commercial business in the UK, or Stephen Green, who does the special situations, or Mark Collins, who chairs our business, or Matteo, who runs around on the Italian side. We have phenomenal people in our team, and there's another 20 names I haven't yet named who are amazing, and their job is to hunt, trap, kill, and eat. So we're in that business, right? So we're not a group that hands off opportunities to others. We do it ourselves, and that's why the team is so crucial. So I think I'm looking forward to deploying the capital, hopefully successfully, and we have a very strong team that does it. And not only are they hunting and originating, but then we have complementary people that help it. Like, for example, we have an in-house development team run by Kevin Cook, but it's Kevin Cook, a guy named Emilio, and Richard Sykes, who the three of those guys really help us understand the bricks and mortar dynamics that might be impacting the business or the ESG aspects that we need to really consider. So collectively as an organization, our competitive advantage, in summary, is that the average tenure is 16 years across the partners. That means 16 years people have been working together on average. The average turnover is under 6% for 25 years in the investment team. I mean, that is just simply unheard of in this business. That's an important part of how we think. I only own, if everyone does their job perfectly, I own about 25% of the business. The team owns 75%. On average, that doesn't always work out. I get a bit more, they get less, but it's roughly that's how it works. So it's really designed that we as an organization are there to look at the opportunity set and deliver and exceed the objectives that we set out for our investors.
Keith, I will be sitting on the sidelines watching you and your team take advantage of the opportunity set for this next cycle. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, thoughts, and opinions. And like I said, excited to see what you and the team go on to achieve.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague. Give us a rating, like, or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of guests that we should have on the show or areas of the market we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People, Property, Place podcast is powered by Rockborn. The team recruit leadership and future leadership hires for real estate owners, funds, investors, and developers. So if you're looking to hire top talent for your business, head over to the website www.rockborn.com, where you'll be able to find a wealth of information, or feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.